Welcome, respected viewers, to a dark and chilling journey through the unforgiving Middle Ages. A tiny flea, carrying a silent and dark contagion, sailed across the ocean to shatter a feudal empire. Kings and wealthy lords who ruled with iron power were completely helpless against this sweeping, dark phantom. This great plague did not merely erase half of Europe. It broke the chains of medieval slavery forever. How did the terrifying microscopic plague become the unexpected savior of the working class? By the mid-14th century, Europe was locked in a rigid and unforgiving feudal system. Massive stone castles cast long, terrifying shadows over the muddy fields of exhausted peasants. The wealthy lords held absolute power over the land, the wealth, and the very lives of their people. These weary serfs were bound to the soil by cruel laws, working endless hours with no hope of true freedom. From sunrise to sunset, they harvested wheat in the mud, handing all their labor to the greedy nobles. The Catholic Church reinforced this strict order, preaching that this suffering was simply divine will. Knights in shining armor patrolled the borders, ensuring that no impoverished slave could ever escape. Society seemed perfectly structured, a rigid pyramid of vast wealth built upon extreme poverty. Yet far across the sparkling Mediterranean Sea, merchant ships were bringing a terrifying doom. Deep inside the dark cargo holds of these wooden vessels, thousands of black rats hid safely among the grain. According to ancient records, these highly ordinary rodents carried a silent, invisible plague. The dark bacteria, known as Yersinia pestis, lived quietly inside the stomachs of these tiny fleas. When the large trading ships finally docked at the busy ports, the hungry rats quickly scurried ashore. They infiltrated the narrow streets of medieval cities, bringing infected fleas into human homes. The crowded and highly unsanitary conditions of Europe created the perfect breeding ground. People lived closely with their animals, tossing raw sewage directly into the open street gutters. Suddenly, people began developing highly painful, swollen black buboes on their necks and their arms. A burning fever consumed their frail bodies, followed by relentless vomiting and agonizing pain. Within a mere matter of days, healthy citizens would collapse on the cold cobblestones and tragically perish. The terrifying Black Death had finally arrived, caring nothing for human titles or immense wealth. Fear rapidly paralyzed the bustling market squares as carts piled high with fallen victims rolled slowly by. The arrogant lords who previously feared no mortal army now faced a completely invisible foe. Thick wooden doors and heavily guarded stone gates offered absolutely no protection against the fleas. The rigid hierarchy that had controlled Europe for centuries was about to face its ultimate test. If an unstoppable force suddenly threatened your entire world, would your wealth actually save you? As the brutal year of 1348 began, the devastating plague reached its absolute, terrifying peak. The relentless invasion swept through dense cities and isolated rural estates with terrifying speed. Medieval medicine was fully useless. Doctors foolishly relied on burning candles and toxic herbs. Mysterious plague doctors emerged from the dense fog, wearing frightening leather masks shaped exactly like bird beaks. They stuffed sweet-smelling flowers into masks, falsely believing that bad air caused the horrific illness. With long wooden canes, they coldly examined the fallen victims, offering no real cure or comfort. Desperate clergymen knelt in the muddy streets, tightly clutching their rusted crosses in pure agony. They prayed for divine mercy, but the silent heavens ignored their desperate cries as the massive losses soared. Ancient texts reveal even the most devoted monks and bishops perished quickly beside their followers. The frightening realization settled in. The righteous and the wicked were being vanquished equally. The proud lords, who once demanded absolute obedience, panicked completely and abandoned their manners. They retreated deep into the remote countryside, selfishly leaving their loyal servants to perish. Yet the microscopic plague followed them relentlessly, riding on the clothing of their remaining guards. Kings and noblemen suffocated in their luxurious silk beds, their frail bodies turning a dark gray. The shiny golden crowns and heavy jewel-encrusted rings meant absolutely nothing to the hungry disease. Entire noble families were wiped out in a single week, leaving their massive stone castles completely empty. Down in the muddy villages, the impoverished serfs suffered tragic losses without any real help. Desperate families were forced to abandon their sick children, locking them inside dark, boarded-up houses. Fallen victims lined the narrow medieval alleys, creating an overwhelming aura of tragic ruin. Traditional funeral rites were completely abandoned. Massive plague pits were frantically dug instead. The grim sound of the wooden cart rattling over uneven cobblestones became a daily, haunting terror. Many survivors believed this was the final apocalypse, the ultimate punishment for human sins. People whipped themselves publicly in the streets, desperately begging God to stop the endless, dark tragedy. Yet the plague continued its relentless march, destroying the foundational pillars of society. The mighty courts of law stood completely empty, and the once powerful military quickly dissolved. Without brutal enforcers to maintain the strict social order, a strange new anarchy began to emerge. Surviving peasants cautiously wandered into abandoned manors, gazing at the deserted luxury. The illusion of noble invincibility was forever shattered by a tiny, invisible bug. When the powerful figures who control your life suddenly vanish, who truly holds the absolute power? The deep psychological trauma across the continent was profound and entirely unprecedented. Talented artists painted the famous Danse Macabre, showing skeletons leading kings and peasants to the grave. This dark artwork perfectly captured the new societal truth. Death is the ultimate equalizer. No amount of silver coins or royal bloodlines could bribe the dark phantom that haunted their quiet towns. The few surviving nobles, hiding in dark isolation, grew terrified of both the plague and the future. They proudly possessed vast expanses of fertile land, but land is truly worthless without the hands to work it. By 1350, the agonizing dust finally settled across the devastated continent. The dark disaster was beyond human comprehension. Half of Europe's entire population had vanished. Once thriving villages were now silent ghost towns, reclaimed by overgrown weeds and wild roaming animals. Countless golden fields of ripe wheat stood entirely abandoned, slowly rotting under the harsh autumn sun. Surviving lords desperately tried to return to normal, demanding their usual heavy harvest taxes. Yet an irreversible shift had clearly occurred within the fundamental structure of the economy. There was a sudden, severe shortage of manual labor to maintain the vast agricultural estates. The remaining serfs, who survived the worst hell imaginable, looked around with a new, sharp clarity. They realized that their sweat and physical labor were the true engines keeping the entire empire alive. A powerful awakening swept through the muddy fields. the poor finally understood their actual worth. When a desperate lord demanded a peasant harvest a field for free, the peasant simply refused to work. For the first time in centuries, oppressed laborers demanded actual silver coins for their difficult tasks. If a noble refused to pay a fair wage, the peasant would simply walk away to find a generous master. Fierce competition for workers forced the arrogant landowners to highly improve their working conditions. Panicked kings attempted to pass strict laws freezing wages to their pre-plague levels, but the effort fully failed. Modern historians note the basic law of supply and demand simply crushed the arrogant royal decrees. Common people started wearing better clothing and eating meat, luxuries once entirely forbidden. In isolated stone halls, weakened nobles sat alone, realizing their supreme authority was breaking. They could no longer threaten the peasants with starvation, for the peasants now proudly controlled the food supply. Heavy iron chains binding families to the same plot of land for generations were finally rusting away. Bold individuals started leaving their ancestral villages, migrating to cities to learn new trades. A bold new middle class of independent artisans and wealthy merchants began to rise from the ashes. The Catholic Church also faced a profound crisis of faith, having failed to protect its most loyal followers. Many wise survivors began to question the ancient dogmas, seeking more logical, scientific answers. The close proximity of death made people deeply value their present lives, rather than just the afterlife. But greedy lords were not willing to surrender their immense traditional privileges without a fight. They ruthlessly attempted to enforce the old, brutal taxes, pushing the newly empowered workers to the brink. The lingering tension was thick. A violent social explosion was absolutely inevitable. Deep in the dark taverns and quiet fields, strong peasant leaders secretly gathered to plan a massive resistance. They sharpened their heavy farming tools, transforming simple harvesting scythes into deadly weapons of war. The fierce fire of rebellion burned brightly in their eyes. They would never return to the dark days of slavery. If you had survived the absolute end of the world, would you ever bow to a cruel and ruthless master again? Across England, France, and Italy, violent drums of peasant uprisings echoed deeply through the valleys. Desperate workers fully organized into a bold, unified force against the wealthy nobility. The great decisive battle between the dying feudal system and the common man was about to commence. These violent peasant revolts erupted furiously across the exhausted continent. The angry laborers marched toward the grand castles, completely destroying old feudal tax records. They fiercely burned the cruel documents that had legally bound their ancestors to the cold, muddy soil. The truly frightened knights in heavy armor desperately tried to suppress the raging crowds, but quickly collapsed. The invincible mounted warriors were easily overwhelmed by a sea of angry farmers. According to formal history, the peasants demanded absolute freedom and much higher wages. Even though many brave rebellions were finally crushed, their powerful message could never be unsaid. The old economic system had been completely shattered, and a wealthy middle class continued to grow. These surviving workers wisely saved their newly earned silver, allowing their children to finally study. This massive and powerful redistribution of wealth ultimately funded the glorious Renaissance. This terrible plague forced a dark, stagnant society to evolve toward bright innovation. The surviving people learned that blind obedience to kings and bishops could not protect them from disaster. It tragically took the horrific loss of millions to permanently break the ruthless chains of feudalism. History clearly demonstrates that sometimes the greatest tragedies bring the very brightest morning dawns. The Dark Plague reshaped medieval Europe forever, but the cycle of plague never really ends. Thousands of years earlier, another mysterious pathogen struck a truly great Eastern Empire. That completely forgotten disease combined with natural disasters to ignite their darkest era yet. Tell us, was this Dark Plague history's ultimate tragedy, or the vital spark for genuine human freedom? Do you truly believe extreme disasters are required to break corrupt systems? Share your thoughts below. If you deeply enjoyed this grand historical journey, please like, share, and subscribe for more amazing content.